Welcome to Tactical Faith Radio. This is Matt Burford. It is a joy and a pleasure to be with you. It's actually morning for me. I usually do my podcast at night, but I have a rare opportunity to get and amass some of my favorite people that I had an opportunity to be around. One of these gentlemen, of course, I've known for a long time, but these other guys that I met around 2014 when I was doing my doctoral work at Beeson Divinity School. I got to meet some gentlemen who are so incredible. Each and every one of them brings something very unique to the table. They're all pastors. They're all teacher preachers. They now all have their doctorate. Very, very impressive people. And I've asked them to come along at this very unique and strange and odd time that we're living in under COVID-19 to think about the church. To think about what is the church going to have to think about in the coming days, weeks, months, and even years as we try to grapple with this crisis of a pandemic. I'm going to spend a few moments just introing who's here. I usually only have one or two people on the podcast, but today it's going to be, 4 or 5. And I'm telling you, you're going to be massively blessed by what these guys bring to the table. I have Dr. Kyle McClellan. He's from Grace Church PCA, Fremont, Nebraska. We probably will have Joel Busby, who's from Grace Fellowship. He's a lead pastor from Homewood. We have Dr. Calvin Bell from Bethel Baptist Church in Bessemer, Alabama. We have Dr. Thomas Fuller. He's the Associate Dean of Beeson Divinity School. And lastly, we have Dr. Cameron Dahl of Faith Community Church in Gambrels, Maryland, who's also the worship pastor. Hey, thank you all for coming on.
Thank you, Matt.
Hey, I'm going to start first with Kyle, and then we're going to move there, and you guys come in and out as you see fit. Kyle, first of all, what caught you? I know Nebraska is a little different kind of state than most of us living in the South, especially in Alabama, because you guys are not in shelter in place. You have different dynamics, different population densities. But you know people that have gone through this. You're watching this, of course, like the rest of us are. Tell me what caught you by surprise as a pastor during this crisis.
Well, the biggest thing as a Nebraskan that's been a shock and caused days of mourning and prayer is that Nebraska football canceled their spring game, which sells out every year. And so that was our day of mourning and weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's been interesting. I think one of the things that we've noted in our state, notorious flyover state, is there shouldn't be, or there isn't, I don't think, a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with COVID-19. We don't have a shelter-at-place order in effect here. Now, we do in the counties that have Lincoln and Omaha, because those are counties that have some kind of population density. But the rest of us, we don't necessarily need it. I mean, we practice social distancing all the time in Nebraska, and it's just kind of a way of life for us.
But there is a definite economic impact. Have you seen any kind of hoarding or anything in your local stores, or?
No, not as much as I think people I've seen it other places. Toilet paper is hard to find, and I think some of those, there's a little bit of that going on in Omaha and Lincoln. But for the most part, folks out here are still kind of self-sufficient, and we don't get fired up about too much. Except, as I've said, the canceling of the Nebraska spring game.
Yeah, we know how that feels here in the South, especially. Well, what about you, Dr. Fuller? As the Associate Dean of Beeson Divinity School, you've held multiple hats. You've been a pastor. You're a professor. You teach. You lead. You're now part of organizing the Divinity School again as the Associate Dean. What are some of the things that have caught you by surprise during this whole crisis?
I've been hearing from some pastors. In fact, was part of a Zoom meeting just a day or two ago with a group, and hearing, I won't call it anxiety, but a lot of questions and speculations about what church is going to look like, what culture is going to look like on the other side of this. I heard the statement made that this is, church is never going to be exactly the same again, that this is going to change everything. And I'm interested and curious, like everyone, to see what sort of the implications and residue of this whole event is in the life of the church. I think it's too early yet to be saying it's going to look this way and be different in that way in an enduring fashion. But the thing that strikes me the most is the need for us to not just jump right back into business as usual when the all clear is sounded, whatever that looks like, and to really take some time to pause, give thanks, and take stock of the ways in which the Lord has worked in our midst and through this, and what things we need to learn from it, both for the sake of being prepared for the same or other similar crises in the future, but also I think to take stock spiritually and ecclesially of what who we are and how we should relate to one another from the things the Lord has shown us through this time. In other words, I think we need to take some time to reflect and not just jump right back into our busyness again. And that's what I hope for anyway.
Yeah, I find that really interesting for somebody that's looked to from the Alabama Baptist perspective as the quote unquote apologetic guy. I've been, hit with a bunch of emails about, give us some apologetic reasoning. These are pastors. Help us, guide us through how do we speak to our congregation about why did God allow this? And I've come to terms with what you just said. Maybe we just need to lament. Maybe we just need to pause. Maybe this is a time where we don't have an answer and we're never given an answer. We're really, really quick to want this crisis to be over. The way that people are talking, it's like May 1st. And, our governor here said yesterday in a press conference that May 1st is when she wants things to start back up. And then I was reminded by somebody the other day in our office that, people like to give during crisis. We're not having a real bad problem right now with churches giving because Christians like to give during a crisis. But my question back to the person was, yeah, but this crisis is not like 9/11. This might be more like the Great Depression, meaning, this is a marathon, not a sprint. We tend to want typical Christians in America. We want the crisis here and then we want it over with. But Dr. Bell, you come in for a second. Dr. Fuller talked about, taking our time and thinking about this issue. How is your community and your church dealing with this?
And so, Dr. Burford, here in the Bessemer area, I think one of the things that have caught me by surprise is the number of older pastors, African-American pastors, who are refusing to close their churches. As a matter of fact, there have been a couple where the police have had to actually go into their services and just disband them. Say, your service had must end, it must end now. And so after I did some researching and had conversation with some of those older pastors in the community, trying to find out, why is it that you refusing to obey a direct mandate from the local health department, as well as state as well as in federal government. And so what I learned from them is that they were very much offended because the church is being deemed non-essential. And Walmart is essential, and other gun stores are essential, but the churches non-essential. And so in their minds, they were hearing that, okay, well, Jesus is non-essential. And so that has been a major problem in our community. And the surprise is that the older pastors are the ones that are doing this, and the younger pastors are more they're more apt to comply with the mandate that came through the CDC. And so that's been kind of a shock. Where you all have been looking at the media and the news. You've seen how this COVID-19 has directly affected the African American community around the United States in just massive ways. And so, with all of the health disparities, high blood pressure, heart disease, cancer, etc. And so our community is being just ravaged by this COVID-19, and the church, what I've been trying to explain to the older pastors is that the church is just, it's a magnet to just kind of help to make this thing spread even further. So we're, in Walmart, people are not loving on each other and hugging on each other, but in the church, we're sitting next to each other. So it's very important that we as African American pastors work hard to communicate to our parishioners that it's important to stay home. And so that's probably one of the things that has caught me most by surprise during this time.
So there's a guy that leads our office who's a big wordsmith, and he says, he doesn't like the idea of essential, non-essential. He likes the idea of exempt and non-exempt. Because everything's essential, right? Everybody's job is essential. I mean, especially essential in terms of being able to, put food on the table. That's really interesting. So I want to bring in Dr. Cameron. Cameron, you're more than just a worship pastor, but that's your experience and your background. What is that? Play a little bit on what Dr. Bell just said about this natural desire for us as Christians to want to get together incarnationally. This whole idea of Zoom and Facebook and social media being a big part of our worship. How are you dealing with that aspect, and how are you thinking through having worship without being with each other?
That's good. It's been a challenge, of course, and sort of piggybacking a little bit on the idea of who's essential and who's not essential. In Maryland, our governor said that churches are non-essential in terms of gathering with 100 people on Sunday morning, but that we were allowed to gather in small groups in order to provide online services. So my praise teams have continued to meet, but the first Sunday we aired, people were commenting, "You're not 6 feet apart." And so now we're meeting and making sure that when we're being filmed, we're 6 feet apart. But another thing that came into our conversation was, what is our perception in the community? And that we didn't want to be perceived as just thumbing our nose at the governor and as a cause of the spread of the virus. So we're not only trying to be safe, but we're also trying to protect the image of the church in the community with what we are doing. But in terms of actually the incarnational part of worship, we have struggled. Just yesterday, I was on a meeting with some of our deacons and elders talking about the implications. And one of the deacons said, I'm in so many Zoom meetings that people, I'm hearing them become weary of Zoom meetings because it's not getting to see one another. It's not getting to smile, to notice just some of your body movements and the way that we communicate with our facial expressions in the same way. And then we began talking about communion, and that we have made the decision so far not to have virtual communion. But then someone brought up, even when we get back together in the new church, people might not be interested right away to pass a plate down the aisle where we're touching everybody again. They might not be interested in having communion in the same way. So as Dr. Fuller was saying, when we get back together, there's still going to be some reflection. And we're also anticipating that as we get back together, it might be incremental. That it might be, well, we can now gather, but in no groups larger than 50 or no groups larger than 100. And that when we have worship services, they might still be encouraging social distancing. So we can have 100 people, but you need to have a chair in between every person. So those are some interesting things that we're dealing with, trying to figure out how to do church right now and then how church is going to look.
I I'm going to bring you in, Kyle, because in the PCA church, of course, communion is looked at a little bit different, of course, than the Baptist church. It has the same significance, but it's looked at differently. Help us here. Help pastors who might be listening to this. How are ways that we can navigate? Let's just say we have 5 or 6 months where we're slowly opening things back up. I'll be honest with you. When I go out now to the grocery store, if I see somebody else, I naturally now in default think, oh man, I really don't want to get next to this person or this person or this person. If I'm thinking that way, I'm thinking most people in churches are going to have that kind of default attitude. As a pastor, how would you help kind of lead your flock to think in terms of protecting yourself from a pandemic, but also wanting to embrace each other as a brother and sister in Christ?
Well, let me start by saying I think the impulse to not do virtual communion is the right one. Within our denomination several years ago, there was an actual case that was brought before the PCA. And one of the things they noted was, if you look at 1 Corinthians 11, 5 times in that text, Paul uses the phrase, and when you gather. So the very clear implication is that communion is not something individuals do in their home by themselves, but rather it's something that is the privilege of God's people as they are gathered together with the word. So we would hold in our tradition that word and sacrament go together. I would also say I think that this is a really good argument for using wine and not grape juice when you take the Lord's Supper, right? I mean, the alcohol in the wine kills whatever's going on, man. So don't worry about it, right? Just make sure it's Mogan David and you're good to go, right? So we've used $2 Chuck for 10 years, and nobody's ever gotten the flu or gotten sick or anything. I think it raises some interesting questions. I think that it's going to be an interesting time. And one of the things that I hope, Dr. Fuller brought up a great point, that church is not going to be the same again. I hope that one of the things that comes out of this, and by hope I mean I'm prayerfully expectant, that we will leave aside the light shows and the entertainment and get back to word, prayer, and sacrament. That we'll get back to kind of the ordinary means of grace as being the driving force that kind of animates the people of God when they gather together. And I don't mean that by any disrespect to Cameron and worship guys, but I think at that point, I'm just convinced again of the sufficiency of the ordinary means of grace. And so I think one of the wonderful opportunities we're going to have is, I think there will be some really interesting catechetical opportunities that are going to be presented in the church. I think this idea of being a faithful presence, of Paul talks about, why does he want to go to Rome? He wants to go to Rome because there are gifts that he wants to impart that he thinks he can only do face to face. And so I hope that we're going to have those kinds of conversations. We're starting to talk about, we normally come and we practice intinction, which in the PCA is a somewhat, we're not exactly towing the line there, but it's otherwise known as rip and dip. And, germaphobes have a hard time with it, which again, if you're using wine, don't sweat it. But we're having to think through, how do we do that? Is this going to change the way in which we actually observe, the actual sort of physical observance of how do we get the elements to people? Right now we have folks come forward, that'll probably continue. But I would imagine that when people come forward, it'll look a little different than it did pre-COVID-19.
What do you think, Dr. Fuller, in terms of hesitation this idea of us. I mean, we're naturally created to want to be with each other. What are you going to do to talk to pastors to help in even future pastors in the seminary think through a crisis like this, to find a happy medium, a wisdom model of thinking about the people in your congregation? Because now we're thinking in terms of the post-COVID world. Who knows when that'll be, a year from now? You know, we're still in the meat of this whole thing, probably even at the very beginning of this thing. But Beeson has had this kind of promotion over the last decade or so about incarnational education, the importance of being together, the importance of moving along together as disciples of Christ as we learn together. That's important for a place like Beeson. But now you're going to have students come in, future pastors and leaders that are going to be affected by what we're going through. So what are ways that we can think about helping not only lay people, but leaders think about the incarnational aspect post-COVID?
I feel confident in saying that after this experience, there's going to be a greater appreciation for the blessing it is to gather together. And I think there's a longing, a yearning for us to be together again. And so I think, I hope that's going to be a good outcome of this, greater appreciation for just what that incarnational communion means, and how easily we can take it for granted. But I think also Kyle made reference to Paul writing to the church at Rome, and in other of his letters, talking about his hope, as for instance to the Philippians, of wanting to come and be with you, and the plans he had, and yet, you know, he makes that turn, I believe, in 1:27 to whatever happens, you know, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And so recognizing that we, you know, live in a world racked by sin. We live in a world where gathering together incarnationally is not always possible, and yet even like in so many of the Psalms of Ascension or of Ascent, that joy at being able to go into the house of the Lord, gather with the people in worship, to enjoy the blessings of that kind of physical communion together is undeniable, and it's something that we should cherish. But I hope from this too that we recognize that the bond that ties us together, that binds us, is something beyond and transcending that physical communion. That across time and space, that we have this fellowship with one another in Christ, regardless of circumstances and other things. And so I think that's one more of those ways, as Kyle also mentioned about the catechetical opportunity that there is in this time and beyond, to help people think more deeply about what it means to be church, what it means to be together in Christ, what Christian unity is about, and that the Lord will use that, as I trust and believe He will, to help grow us and to build our understanding more maturely of who we are as the body of Christ.
I think something Dr. Fuller said is really crucial, which is, do our people actually know the difference between the church visible and the church invisible? Because I think that's a really helpful category, that if your folks don't have that, they're struggling. I think they're going to struggle even more so with trying to think through, okay, well, maybe it wasn't so bad that I couldn't get to church to be with people. So why, you know, if they're just going to put it on the internet, why would I want to mess with trying to show up and be gathered with people?
Yeah. So Joel, you're on now. We're in this discussion of not only what caught us by surprise, but now we've moved over into a discussion about what does it mean to be together as a church. And I'd also made the note of saying when we go out now that it's been hammered in our skull about 6 feet apart and social distancing and all this kind of language. One of the things we have to think about now is that's the default that people are bringing to the table when we do start going back to church. But so how do we help lead? And this is something important I think that you can bring to the table too at Grace Fellowships, is because you're a relationship person first. I mean, I've known you for a while now. Relationships are important to you. How are you thinking about navigating and leading your people to start not putting walls up the minute you see a stranger? You want to be careful and you want to use wisdom, but at the same time, these pandemics bring out sometimes the worst in us. And one of those, which is a natural desire to defend ourselves and our families against something that's unknown. But you don't want to block yourself off from your brother and sister in Christ, and an opportunity to bring those that are not into the fold, as well, because we're putting up these barriers between each other.
Yeah. There's something that at our church we've been really trying to think critically about. On the one hand, the Christian life is a life of dying to oneself. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Life Together talks about how, one of the main things God will do in Christian community is to bring you all sorts of interruptions and disruptions from what you plan to do. And those disruptions and interruptions actually come in the form of people. And that's actually one of the most important things that the Lord does in Christian community is really your walled off sense of self becomes more porous, and people get in your space. And that's actually part of what the promise of a church community is. Now, on the other hand, one of the things we've talked about around our church is how do we promote unity? How do we make sure we don't create divisions in our church from sort of the immunosuppressed people are super, super nervous. The rest of us are kind of free and footloose and fancy free. Or the scaredy cats among us don't want to sit near anybody. Mm-hmm. But the people who are trusting the Lord are just going about business like normal. And we've already just seen those kind of divisions creep up. I mean, there are people in our church family that don't want to, pull their car out of their driveway for, either misplaced or well-placed fears given their circumstances. And there's even can be a tone of, well, look at those scaredy cat people who just don't trust the Lord. I mean, so I think that's the tension that church leaders have to negotiate is how do we just understand that having people in your business is church life? But on the other hand, how do we promote unity as we move forward, and allow some common sense measures to be a support to folks whose consciences maybe are pricked in a different way?
What do you think? What do you think, Dr. Bell?
Well, so my community is a very unique community, Dr. Burford. So African American people are numb to, say, coronavirus, COVID-19, and it's by and large due to the history of us, our history as Americans, slavery, lynchings, and in the 50s and the 60s. Today, even black on black murders in our community, they are just off the chart. 50% of all African American murders, black on black murders, go unsolved. And so with that, you have just this numbness to say that the coronavirus. And so us not coming together, us being in a common space is not so much as nerve-wracking to us as probably most people. Now, there are, as Joel said, the scaredy cats, and they are few and far in between. When you look at, what the number of lives that are taken from Black people that are lives that are taken with high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, and so forth, so on, just not having that high quality of health care or whatever. So death, it surrounds us. And so the fear of staying away from each other is just really not a reality for the majority of us. And so I think that's also one of the problems that's adding to the rates of deaths that's taking place in the African American community. When we first heard about COVID-19, the coronavirus, it was just another situation in the life of our community. So why should we be afraid of that? Gosh, when we work out the numbers of the number of Black men that are murdered by one another in America over the course of the year, well, coronavirus is only scratching the surface after that. Yeah. So I don't think that we've gotten to the place where we're thinking about, okay, once we come back together as a church, how are we going to deal with being scattered? That's just not our greatest concern. It should be as we're looking at this pandemic for sure. But I think we're just in a different place as a people. And Calvin Bell, as a pastor, I'm having to grapple with. As a matter of fact, I was having a discussion with my wife Shanetta on last evening about it. So when the governor lifts the ban of so that we can begin to come back together, whether it's incremental in groups of 50, etc. When we're asked to come back to the church, what should my response be as a pastor? Should I actually use caution? Because again, the way this thing is spreading within our community, should I use caution and probably prolong the process and say, hey, let's stay out a little bit longer just to make sure that this thing doesn't turn back on us and begin to be a bit more aggressive in our community than it was before.
Cameron, what do you think?
I think it is definitely a challenge, and we have those in our church. We have one family who's social distancing in their house, and then my stepdad and mom live a couple hours from here, and she said he's going around their house disinfecting things, and she's like, "We're the only people here. Why are you disinfecting things every day?" So there's a lot of unknowns, and people are afraid of that. But the other side of that is there are opportunities that we've had. Again, my praise teams are still coming to the church to record. And there is, as Dr. Fuller said earlier, I think there's a hunger to be with people, even at 6 feet apart or 8 feet apart. And those opportunities, I think, are going to be there and helping people navigate that as we get back together. Is going to be a challenge, but I do think there's going to be such a hunger and such a longing to see one another, but maybe not hug one another. Not yet.
Right hand of fellowship and the holy kiss might need to be off the table for a little while.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's interesting. So, Dr. Fuller, what does that mean? What are some protocols? I mean, are y'all thinking about that even at Beeson for when this lifts eventually, whether it's, months from now or even a year from now when we get a vaccine? I mean, what are some protocols for pastors and leaders to think about as they navigate these things? Because as Dr. Bell is showing us, there's cultures who, like the African American culture, they're naturally relationship oriented. They embrace each other. You don't want to tell your church, I don't know. It just seems to me that if I entered a church and the pastor had rules and regulations on how we're supposed to act with each other, it seems like at first thought that it would take away some from the worship experience. So how would you go about helping pastors create protocols for coming back?
Well, I hope and trust that the CDC and other authorities will give us some guidelines for that to begin with, and not just say, okay, shelter in place is lifted, everybody, as you were, and but that there will be some counsel given for how we might just use a good sense to ease back into this. And as has already been noted, there are going to be people who, just because of their own particular concerns and anxieties, will sort of practice that without being told. So this is going to be an adjustment coming back together, and needs to be an adjustment coming back together. And I think in the same way that we had to frame, I think thoughtful pastors probably had to give thought to how to frame the whole matter of us not meeting together. When that began, there's going to need to be some more of that kind of guidance pastorally given, that the same biblical rationale of loving your neighbor, loving one another, and in this case, a real tangible form of that love is staying 6 feet apart from them, and wearing a mask and so forth. And so that same loving disposition, I think, coming back together will say, let's just ease into this. Let's recognize that, yes, there is the very real possibility of a resurgence of the virus, and we've all become now acclimated to not just being shoulder to shoulder. And let's just ease back into this and follow the guidance and counsel that's given us by those who are in science and medicine as to what best practices are. And I think in a Romans 13 kind of way too, it's submission to the authorities who, in this case, we trust and believe have our best interest at heart, and want to see us move past this as every bit as much as we do. And so not kind of creating this Christ against culture or whatever kind of dichotomy that we live in a different world of faith where we're not susceptible to all the same ills and effects as the rest of society is. So
that's great. So Joel, taking a little bit of that too, how do we think about fear and death and faithful presence? You alluded to it earlier, but give us a few short minutes, kind of your thoughts about being faithfully present. And what are some of the things that we can learn, not only as leaders, but as lay people? What is this coronavirus teaching us about ourselves and what we need to change and adjust? And Kyle alluded to it earlier as well before you came on, but what are some things that we can learn that'll help us grow as Christians?
Yeah. I know that as a pastor, I minister in a suburban context. Although I am, 10, 15-minute drive from where my brother Calvin is, I really minister in a different world. And I live and minister in a world where, and this is going to almost sound funny, like when I say it out loud, you might be tempted to laugh. But a lot of my people, a lot of them kind of young, professional, well-to-do people, they actually think they're in control of their own life. Mm-hmm. And I just think as a pastor to people like that, you spend a lot of your time essentially trying to convince people that they're not, and that they need to have a dependency on God. And when you say that, the people who've suffered some in the room shake their head at you as if they know what you mean. The people who've not suffered very much shake their head at you, but you can tell they're shaking their head at you from a place of not exactly knowing what you mean. So I think for us, it's really, I could tell a personal story about one particular person in our church that has been affected by this deeply. But I just think more than anything, I think it just shows us how not in control of our lives we really are. And I think that's a really healthy thing for a Christian to learn. I think it's a freeing thing for a Christian to learn. I think that, and I think we're wise to try to continue to build upon that. I think we should help people understand in deep ways the things that are actually to be feared and the things that don't have to be feared, and to really think theologically with our people about fear. Those are the things that come to my mind. So, my instincts when things normalize a little bit is that some of the ways that we've had to depend upon one another some of the ways in which we haven't been able to just naturally trust the professional clergy, but having to lean on one another. Those are things I hope we just maintain. That's what comes to my mind, Matt.
Yeah, man. And the idea, listen, before I got my COVID 15-pound belly that I have now from, I need a social distance from my refrigerator, by the way. But I was working out with somebody in January, and they were a friend of mine. I've known him for 2 or 3 years. And I just simply asked him, and this was probably before I went on a trip to Japan for the International Mission Board. I asked him, hey, when's the last time? Because I know he has 3 kids and he's really busy. He's very affluent business owner, and he has 3 children. They're all in the high school age or middle school to high school. I said, when's the last time you've had dinner with your kids? Because I know him and his wife are everywhere, so busy. And he had told me it had been 3.5 years before since him and his wife have sat down with their children. That's changed. That's totally changed. He's no longer going to his business. He's staying at home. He's with his family. He's doing the job that a husband and a father should do. But what you're telling me, Joel, is just reminding me that we're supposed to be still. And I had said before earlier, I don't have any answers for what's going on. And the thing that's really kind of brought to my attention is not very many people do right now. The people that we lean on that are authorities in their field, especially when it comes to disease and pandemics, they're at the very beginning of this game, and they're trying desperately to figure out a way to lessen the amount of deaths. But the reality is, if you sit still and you reflect, you realize just what you said. Very little of this stuff we have control over. Very little of these things that we even have knowledge. And the pursuit of knowledge is really the pursuit of control. And sometimes we don't have that. I mean, what do you think about that, Kyle? I mean, to think that maybe this is a time for us this might be a longer deal than we're really ready for. So I know Midwest people. You've told me about Midwest people. You're a Nebraska guy. Y'all are almost made to like a tortoise to slowly move through this crisis. We're not. The people that I'm around are not.
I prefer more Buffalo.
Okay, we'll go Buffalo.
There we go. Thank you. A little higher on the food chain. I would say there are a couple things that in our conversation stood out to me. One, I think we have a really unique opportunity moving forward as the church to rediscover truth telling. Mm-hmm. Not spin, not hyperbole.
Oh man.
Not Jesus is the key to my best life now, but, and I'm struck by something Calvin said when he's talking about the African American community and said, death surrounds us. Mm. Well, guess what?
Yep.
That's true for all of us.
Yep. Like, have you not figured that out? Now, it's more palpable in Calvin's community, but, it's appointed for a man to die once and then to face judgment. And so I hope that we will rediscover the kind of both the beauty and the essential nature of the church bearing witness to the truth. And speaking of things, because I think I know my wife and I were talking about this morning. One of the things I think that's creating anxiety is, well, who the heck's actually telling you the truth about some of this stuff? Mm-hmm. I mean, are the death numbers, are they inflated? Is this a Chinese conspiracy? Is this the media that hates Trump? Is this Trump just being Trump? I mean, what's going on? Nobody knows. But I think we have a really wonderful opportunity moving forward to just rediscover truth telling and rediscover, hey, death surrounds all of us. And you know what? There are worse things than losing your life to COVID-19. Like, there really are. Yeah.
To face an eternity of judgment is far worse than death from COVID-19.
Mhm.
And man, I hope that we can rediscover that. I hope that we can stop all the spiel and all the marketing and all the fluff, and get back to some of the things that we've been talking about. I also think it's a unique thing. One of the things that the church has kind of always, I think when it's healthy, realized it's supposed to be about is we're always giving a minority report. Always.
Yeah.
Now it's a minority report that's in keeping with, I hope, God's revelation of himself and his word. But how about if we rediscover that as well? That, we have this very different way to view the world than folks who are concerned with hype and spin and everything else. And why don't we get back to that?
Yeah.
Let's
so
give
good,
it a
Kyle.
go.
Kyle, that is so good. And when Calvin was speaking, I was reminded of, and then when you were just sharing, I was reminded of a poem by T.S. Eliot. And he says this: why should men or women love the church? Why should they love her laws? It's because she tells them of life and death and all that they would forget. She is tender, meaning the church. She is tender where they would be hard. And she is hard where they would like to be soft. She, the church, tells them of evil and sin and other unpleasant facts. They constantly try to escape from the darkness outside and within by dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. But the man that is shallow, but the man that is will shadow the man that pretends to be. I think that is our unique role, is to tell the world of evil and sin and other unpleasant facts.
Yeah.
And it's also our role to be tender where they would be hard, and to be hard where they would want to be soft. And I
think that's been the other real hard thing, and the other real challenge is, I think because we've all had more than kind of a passing affiliation with Beeson, we want to express that tenderness person to person, face to face, because that's a core value of Beeson Divinity School.
Yes.
Right? There is no such thing as virtual ministry.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't send a hologram.
Though he could have.
He could have, yeah. But the whole idea is, no, it's face to face, it's person to person, it's life on life. And again, Calvin's community has known that for 300 years, and we're figuring it out. But I think that's been another real challenge is, I've realized I'm actually not gaining weight, Burford. I'm losing weight because I'm not having lunch 4 times a week with different people in my congregation. I mean, I realize I eat lunch professionally. That's like the number 2 thing on my I word in sacrament, and then I eat lunch professionally.
You can't get the Baptist out of you, though.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Though being away from Birmingham is helpful.
Barbecue factor.
Oh man, Saws. I miss you guys, but I miss you guys at Saws even more.
Matt, could I say just one follow-up on that there's never a time when we cease needing to be peacemakers, needing to be those who give expression to what peace really is. But I think this has been and will continue to be a really acute time of the church and the world beyond the church needing to hear the word of peace that comes through the gospel. Jesus in the boat with the disciples on the sea raging, and his word of peace that calmed nature. His word of peace then coming after the resurrection into the company of the disciples, locked behind doors and fearful, and coming in his presence being that peace, his word to them, his promises to them. And fear has a place, but fear reigning is always a bad outcome, and it doesn't look good on the church.
Mm.
And beyond concerns for image is just the basic question of who we are as the people to whom Christ has spoken that word of peace, and more than spoken it, has made it in his death and resurrection. And so I think that'll be one more of the ways in which we can and should really help our people to grow through this crisis, to recognize what peace looks like and means for those who are in Christ, and how they can also then bear witness to that peace to the unbelieving world in their communities and beyond.
Dr. Burford, I am hoping that on the other side of this COVID-19 crisis pandemic, in the African American community in particular, is that there could be a paradigm shift from Good Friday, or that Passion Friday when Jesus is lynched. I mean, it is death, and it is death like none other has seen. And my community, African Americans, we are stuck in Friday. Yes, we celebrate the fact that yes, Jesus got up. If you hear the African American and Baptist context preaching, preaching Jesus getting up on Sunday morning, it's a very powerful thing. It's exciting, and we crescendo there very often. But as a people in particular, we are yet stuck, even with the modern advances, the modern all of the progress that has been made over the last 50, 60 years, the African American community. Still there's that love where we're still hanging out on Friday. And again, as I said earlier, death surrounds us. And so there's this natural numbness to that. And so I pray that on the other side of this corona situation, that we somehow God is doing something in the midst that is moving our minds away from just Friday to actually believing that Sunday is a reality that is here and now for us, that Christ is risen, and that whereas we are in our tradition, I even going back to the earlier statement where I talked about the older pastors not wanting to close their churches, and basically on the non-essential argument, but on the other side of that is that many of those pastors weren't going to close their churches because the African American church has always been the hub of our community through the civil rights, the slavery, when we couldn't worship, in public. We went to the brush harbors and we worshiped. We prayed our way through. We sung our way through. We worshiped when we were in the cotton fields. We sang praises and so that's how we got over. And so there's that natural inclination for us to just kind of, stay in that area to say, so church is essential, church is important, so we got to come together. And so finally we're ready to get back together. Let us do what we know to do. Let's pray, and so that if we're not careful, we'll still find ourselves again hanging in Friday, because this disease is very critical. So I'm hoping that there would be some kind of enlightenment in our minds to say beyond this thing that coronavirus has taught us the value of who Christ is. I hope that we learn not just the African American community, but also the church universal. I hope that we learn from the coronavirus of COVID-19 that COVID-19, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't care about poverty. It doesn't care about what race, what gender you are. It doesn't. It's not concerned whether you're gay or straight, for that matter. So I hope that the universal church, beyond this COVID-19, this crisis, that we can move into a place where we see that all of our brothers and sisters in the world are important, that we're all made in the image of God. I know I'm probably a bit too long here, but I'm gonna try to say this and I'll shut it down. Over the last 20 years, since 1998, I have basically been a part of two communities. From 1998, I became the first African American who worked in the maintenance department in Kirkland Clinic. Very first African American in that department at UAB, Kirkland Clinic, UAB, and so those gentlemen who worked in that department, they had to make a shift in their minds, as well as I had to make one in my mind. They were used to using N-word just frequently around each other. There was no one to just say, hey, we shouldn't do that. And all of a sudden, there's this black guy, Kevin, who's there. And now, okay, well, when they're about to say it, and all of a sudden you look at, oh, that's Kevin there. And also I had to kind of put off some of the anger and the frustration that I held for many years, being raised in the black belt in West Alabama, which is one of the poorest zip codes in the United States. And so I'm having to say, okay, develop tougher skin so that I'm not offended by every little statement or whatever the case. I moved from there, 98 on up into 2003, where I began my theological studies at Southeastern Bible College, and I was a minority on that campus. I was on 280, then moved over to Valleydale, and then finished that degree up and on to Beeson. And so where I've spent from 2007 up into just 2017, just on and off, I spent a lot of time on that campus, in that community. So I've lived in from 98 till now. It's like I've on one side of the mountain, there's privilege, there's Christianity that you know is sensitive to, you know, it's taking the front a front stand against sexual immorality and very many things that are very much of value to me and to every Christian. On the other hand, on the other side, in the community where I live, there are people who are more taking a stand more that deals more with, okay, well, social justice or injustice. And there are these two different Christian camps that are fighting it out and battling it out. And I think, you know, even as we, you know, in this time where we are, getting ready to elect a president in November. And so there's the tension between Democrats and Republicans that's been around for so long. And that same tension I've lived in the middle of those two tensions in the churches. There's this right-wing Christianity in one community, and there's this left-wing Christianity in the other community. And the tension between those two they're massive. And I'm hoping that this coronavirus thing, even as you've seen Democrats and Republicans begin to kind of think, find some common ground, and it's still distant ways apart. But can we universally come together and just kind of look at what are our core values, and what are the things that we have in common, and let us make that thing the most important thing, so that we in these last days can win people to Christ. Mm-hmm. Sorry for the rambling.
No, don't ever be sorry for that. Cameron, I'll give you the last word. And for those that are listening, we've gone about an hour. This is one of the reasons why I'm so impressed with these group of God-fearing men. They're leading. They're out in the front. They're very thoughtful and reflective. I mean, this is the kind of Christian that I've always wanted to be around and surround and help other churches help develop these kind of Christians. So please lift these guys up as they think through these issues, along with all the other pastor leaders and all the leaders in every area that are dealing with this in one way or another. Thank you all so much for coming on. But Cameron, give me something hope-filled. You're the worship guy. You're always the guy that's always kind of got a smile on your face. Give us some hope. Lift us up, bring us to the throne, give us a word of encouragement, something that God has shown you through this that you actually think is a really big positive.
Well, I've been going through 1 Peter with very slowly with our congregation virtually as we go through this. And one of the things that I've been reminded of weekly through my studies is the exhortation to rejoice. You hear it in Paul, you hear it in Peter, to rejoice. Now they don't look away from the struggles. They embrace the struggles. They say, you're going to go through struggles. This is the norm. And I'm always lured into thinking that struggles are abnormal, but over and over and over again, the Bible tells us this is the norm. You're going to have struggles in this life. but rejoice. Rejoice. Jesus has overcome this world. Rejoice. These struggles are only going to last for a little while. Rejoice. And one of the things I just looked at this week in 1 Peter 1:6, it says, though necessarily for a little while, you will have to grieve these trials. And I was like, it's okay for me to be sad. It's okay for me to experience grief. That's the norm when you face suffering. But even because of that, even through the sufferings, rejoice. Rejoice. There is hope. So I hope that exhortation to rejoice, that it's okay to grieve, that it's okay to struggle, but we can still rejoice. I hope that's a word of hope.
Well, thank you all so much for coming on. Thank you for those who are listening. Of course, this is partly what my nonprofit was meant to do, was founded to do, was established to do. This is kind of in my wheelhouse. I've enjoyed gathering like-minded people together, men and women, to think about these things deeply and significantly. If you want to know more, go to tacticalfaith.com. This won't be the last time that I try to get my guys together. We're all over the place, and if I have to use this podcast to get my brothers together, we'll do it. Thank you all for coming on. Thank you for the time. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for being the kind of Christians that you are. I love each and every one of you. And it's such a pleasure and a blessing to know each and every one of you. And I pray for your families, and let me know if you need anything from me. For those that would like to get involved more with Tactical Faith, of course, go to our website. Email me at matt@tacticalfaith.com. For those who are out there right now that are having issues, I pray for you. I pray for your families. This is a trying time, but as we have heard, we can still find hope. Friday was needed. Good Friday was needed, but we do have Sunday, as we've been reminded. And the hope is that Christ is on his throne, and he's there now as we speak, and he was not caught surprised by this. So thank you for coming on, and we will check you later. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Matt.
Hey, thank y'all.
Thanks, bud.
And that was great. Thank you for, let's do it again.
Absolutely.
Dr. Fuller,
Yes, sir.
I assume this is somewhat of the dream of like a D-Min program, is that it creates a squadron of